The first ones to discover the Terrans were actually the Rokoi, but they never made official first contact with them. No, they were content with observing them from afar, and clandestinely experimenting on the Terran population whenever convenient. In hindsight, I can't blame them. The galaxy would have been considerably less horrifying if the Terrans were left alone on that rock of theirs till the end of time, but alas. So no, it wasn't the Brainiacs that discovered them, but they were the first ones to make contact with them. It was shortly after the end of the Brainiacs-Rokoi War, you see, and the Rokoi government structure was shattered. This allowed Rokoi state secrets to be essentially handed over to the Brainiacs. From experimental weaponry and war doctrines, to unclaimed mineral-rich systems, it all fell right into the Brainiacs' lap. One of those state secrets was the location of Terra. Of course, either the Brainiacs or the Rokoi called it Terra. Hell, even the Terrans didn't call their world Terra back then. It was only marked as a ridiculously long chain of numbers and letters. What drew the Brainiacs' attention to that particular chain of numbers and letters, however, was the fact that it was designated as not only habitable, but also habitat. Now, before I continue, there are two things you should know about the Brainiacs. 1. They had what we call a shared consciousness. While most sophiant species in the galaxy have a percentage of their neurons, or neuron equivalents, dedicated to empathizing and understanding other members of their species, the Brainiac's brain was almost completely made up of those mirror neurons. This, coupled with their ability to broadcast their thoughts through quantum teleportation, allowed each single individual to be cerebrally connected with every other individual of their species within a range of about 1,000 units. Entire systems worth of populations, all of them sharing thoughts and most importantly emotions, in an incredibly direct and visceral fashion, creating vast neural networks. Truly a remarkable ability, we unfortunately can longer study. 2. They were paranoid. Completely and utterly paranoid. They perceived every sentient species within their space to be a threat to their very existence, allowing of course only two courses of action to be taken: fight or flight. So, when the Brainiacs found Terra through the Rokoi Republic's archives, and they saw it fell within their newly expanded borders, they did what their nature compelled them to. They contacted the Terrans, and they gave them an ultimatum. Move out, away from our territory, or be exterminated. Keep in mind that this was over 300 standard years ago. The Imperium of Terra wasn't a thing yet, and neither was its massive void navy. Their dominion of the stars extended entirely within their own backyard. A bunch of satellites and a few research stations sprinkled within their system represented their full void-faring ability at the time. As a result, relocating a population of billions from one planet to another was clearly out of the question, leaving the Terrans with only one, slightly less impossible option: defending their home against extrastellar invaders that were literally centuries ahead in technological advancement, outnumbered them to a staggering degree, and had abilities the Terrans at the time would consider magic. This, sadly, is a scenario the galaxy has witnessed more than once. A far more advanced star nation stumbles across a new species that can barely tie its shoelaces, assuming its physiology allows for shoes, and for whatever reason, be it expansionism, resource exploitation, or as in this case, a preemptive strike mentality, decides to wipe them from existence. The Brainiacs, being the ever-paranoid species that they were, showed up on Terra's doorstep with an entire expeditionary fleet. Imagine that, an entire fleet, for just one planet. Only when they tried to barge in, they found that the door was locked. The lock had the form of a layer of radiation spanning above the entire planet. A nuclear umbrella, as military historians have dubbed it. Some species, the Taraxim in particular, have even adopted this little stratagem as an emergency defense solution for worlds that don't have planetary plasma shields, albeit their version is more refined, and less suicidal than what the Terrans did. You see, the Terrans put that nuclear umbrella up by detonating hundreds of thousands of nuclear devices on the edge of their atmo. Then they used their primitive planetscaping installations that were meant to help them with their world's shifting climate, in order to keep the nuclear material airborne for as long as possible. Needless to say, the ramifications this had on Terra were vast. The weather manipulation alone, was responsible for entire oceans drying up, and fallout inevitably found its way to the ground, contaminating the majority of Terra's surface. The lucky amongst them were relegated to lives underground, in vast shelters. The not-so-lucky, well, at least their deaths were somewhat quick. The plan had succeeded, though. Terrans had burned their own sky and poisoned the very air they breathed, but they had done it. Their planet was now encircled by a blanket of radiation as intense as that of pulsar beam. You can put as much radiation shielding on your ship as you want. At that level, it's simply not survivable, not even for machines. Everything with the circuit was getting fried halfway through the umbrella, and sending transports with troops on them wasn't even on the table. Dumb projectiles, though, like plasma strikes, tungsten rods, and good old unguided antimatter munitions were used in abundance, charring entire continents. Too bad for the Brainiacs, the Terrans had already dug themselves deep underground, and without proper visual on the planet's surface, another effect of the nuclear umbrella, precision strikes to force them out were impossible. For 8 years the Terrans endured like this, buried beneath the ground as the soil above them got burned, shattered, poisoned, and burned again. Those in unlucky shelters that found themselves too close to a plasma barrage would be incinerated by the millions. Yet the Terrans endured. Starvation would strike shelters that in bouts of philanthropy had taken in more people than they should have. Yet the Terrans endured. Disease, the uncaring reaper, would manifest at random, decimating entire populations in the close confines of the shelters. Yet the Terrans endured. Radiation, the same radiation that was meant to protect them, would leak inside the shelters and make their flesh rot on their bones before their eyes. Yet the Terrans endured. I know the war was later named the Brainiacs Extinction, but the Terrans got pretty close to becoming extinct themselves. Finally, without warning, the radiation was allowed to scatter and dissipate away as the planet-scapping machines were turned off. The umbrella was pulled down, and the night sky over Terra was once again black, instead of the sickly glowing blue that had come to define it for the past decade. There's still debate over whether the Terrans came up with the technology on their own, or if they managed to reverse engineer Rekoy tech from research stations and planetside sites that got abandoned. Once the skies had cleared, countless vessels shot up from the entrails of Terra to the heavens above. Well, you could hardly call them vessels, they were more like glorified breaching pods, but it didn't matter, they did their job all the same. Before the Brainiacs could even put their metaphorical boots on, the Terrans had already infiltrated almost every void craft in the fleet. Nobody knows for sure what happened in those ships. The Brainiacs are now extinct, and the Terrans have never been famous for their willingness to release combat reports to the rest of the galaxy. But what we managed to cobble together from loose radio transmissions between Terran soldiers paints a pretty grim image. The Terran laughter and cheers amidst the sounds of Brainiac's flesh being rent apart. Words aren't quite enough to describe that kind of mania. That kind of malice. Just try to imagine the pent-up rage you would have after being buried alive for almost a standard decade, seeing your family and friends suffer from hunger, disease, and radiation sickness, or just straight up burn alive, as your home above gets shredded to atoms by antimatter bombs. All that for the terrible crime of daring to be alive. The Terrans were out for blood. And blood was what they got. The fleet managed to transmit a distress signal across every possible channel of communication and wavelength before going dark. That was how we caught wind of the unfolding situation and decided to monitor it. There were those who advocated for doing more than simply observing, mind you, but nobody in the Prime Council wanted to breach the Brainiacs' border policy and risk creating additional tensions with them. So, along with the rest of the galaxy, we sat back and observed as the end of the Brainiacs' star had begun. A standard year later, deep void listening probes were able to pick up the photon signatures from the engines of the ships and track the fleet as it traveled through Brainiacs' space. Something was different about it, though. The fleet was somehow warped. The way it acted, it didn't even resemble a group of ships, it was more like a black hole. Everything near it would just disappear. Brainiacs mining and research stations would go dark as soon as the fleet got close to their system. Entire shipping lanes would go silent. Other fleets and strike forces sent to intercept it would cease all communications and start drifting in the void without a single shot being fired. When it eventually reached planets colonized by the Brainiacs, a spike in outbound traffic requesting help would be detected from the besieged world. Then gradually the pleas for help would grow fewer and fewer, until finally the whole planet would fall silent. The weaponry required to exterminate a planetary population, even that of a small colony, leaves traces that can be tracked across half the galaxy. Where the Terran fleet passed, not so much as a spark was lit. It's a very unique kind of dread. Witnessing neighboring worlds be covered by a veil of silence one by one. Knowing yours may very well be next in line to be devoured by an unknown and uncowable enemy that can erase you from existence with seemingly nothing more than a snap of his fingers. Knowing there's nothing you can do about it. It didn't take long for the Brainiacs to start giving names to that dread. The Dread Fleet was the first to be coined, and the least imaginative. The Great Devourer was the favored name of groups within Brainiacs society that actually started worshipping the Terran fleet as some kind of vengeful deity. The most eloquent and accurate though was simply, the End. Relatively recently, images of that fleet, of the End, were declassified. No, it wasn't some spy that managed to sneak on board one of those ships and take them. It was the Terrans themselves that took them. Back then they weren't that savvy with communications encryption, you see. Plus, the propensity of their troops to immortalize their travels didn't do their counterintelligence any favors. The ships were retrofitted. Obviously, we were assuming that much even before we got access to those images. The Terran and Brainiacs physiologies were hardly compatible, but we weren't expecting the changes to be quite that radical. On the outside, they were completely stripped of offensive equipment. No railguns, no directed energy batteries, not even torpedo bays. Only the point defense systems were left intact. Instead, the weapons were replaced with additional cargo compartments. If you ignored the military markings, you'd be excused to think it was an armada of freighters. On the inside, well, let me ask you a question. Are you familiar with the concept of hell? Good. That's a good place to start describing what those cargo holds looked like. Remember how I said the Brainiacs shared thoughts and emotions across planetary distances? Well, they also shared trauma. Both physical pain and mental anguish could be transmitted from Brainiacs to Brainiacs. Every star nation that had dealings with them at the time knew that, but the practical, wartime applications of this bit of trivia weren't acknowledged or implemented by anyone. I like to think we were noble to ignore the option that the Terrans so eagerly embraced. In reality, though, I think we were just too stupid. Not that it matters much now, the galaxy is a much wiser place today, a much more brutal one. The Terrans made sure of that. They turned the fleet that had come to bathe their world in fire into a void-faring torture chamber, a traveling circus of pain. Every star nation engages in enhanced interrogation, despite what the Prime Council may officially state, and nobody is foreign to the concept of acceptable civilian casualties. But the Terrans? The Terrans have elevated war crimes to an art form. The things they did to captive Brainiacs in those ships. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say our vocabulary is too limited to paint a proper picture of them. The methods of torture would vary. Slow removal of the subject's carapace piece by piece, injection with paralytic and then caustic agents, forced auto-cannibalism, plain old mutilation until nothing more than the brain stem remained. You couldn't accuse them of lack of imagination. Yet the first couple of steps would always be the same. Standard procedure began with placing a mirror in front of the unfortunate subject, removing its eyelids, so it could witness every horror its body was about to be subjected to, and bringing in a team of Terran medics that would ensure the subject remained alive and conscious for as long as possible. And so, this carnival of suffering would drift among the stars, stopping from system to put on its cruel performance. No matter how big or how small the audience, no matter how much they begged and pleaded for mercy as their psyches shuddered beneath the weight of their brother's pain. The most resilient amongst the Brainiacs, the ones that hadn't died or fallen into a coma by the time the curtain had fallen, would be recruited as new vessels of despair. The show would go on, and the dark imperium of Terra would grow larger and larger. When only a handful of Brainiacs planets remained unvisited by the fleet, they once again transmitted a message over every wavelength and channel. A transmission that still echoes throughout the galaxy amidst background static radiation interference. Please stop. But Terra marched on.